You are being poisoned. Everything is filth. One thing that makes the modern world actually so much worse than the ancient degradation that has always been the lot of mortal humans. But modern world is worse because you can't really escape it. Your food, your water, the air, the things you touch, the receipts, as you know, but mainly, of course, the food is poisoned systematically and on multiple stages of production. The water as well. I don't know, and I don't care if it's deliberate attempt to wipe out humanity the way Alex Jones says. But does it matter in the end? Because even if it's done just for profit, the human beast is such a mendacious and wicked creatura that even when it shivs you for profit or personal gain, it needs, in some cases, even to pretend that it's out of a demonic wickedness and not just for money. It cries out in pain as it strikes you. In other words, there's a way in which certain kinds of people feel the need to dehumanize their victims so they can better pilfer them with a clean conscience, or even with joy. Look at the beautiful young ladies who call unborn babies clumps of cells, and in an exaggerated way feel the need to engage in the vilest smear, such as to call babies in their wombs parasites and other such words. They feel this need to engage in cruelty and in meanness towards their victims. Look at the lore also that developed, for example, among Ashkenazi Jews about peasants, and in particular about Polish or Ukrainian peasants. You must understand why this is. It's because the Polish nobles left for Paris or other places, and they gave tax farming contract to local Jews who, under the title of tax collector or arrendator, these were their tax enforcers, and therefore they had to exaggerate a dehumanizing ideology about their victims so as to better squeeze them. You don't hear that part of the story ever, I am sure. It is repeated in other parts of Europe, but this actually is a universal phenomenon among middlemen minorities with similar tasks, whether you look to the Orient or in Africa, where much of the commerce was in the hands of the Arabs historically. And the cruelty here is of a mean and a wretched character. It is subterranean cruelty. It is effeminate. It is unlike, for example, the frank and manly cruelty of the Homeric heroes, who will just rob you with force, their own force, not someone else's, or like the Tutsi warlords in Rwanda, or like other warrior races who have no need of womanly self-justifications the way these other kinds of merchant peoples do. So then I'm not privy actually to the inner congresses of the ruling class, nor especially of people like Monsanto or the agrochemical lobbies that produce glyphosate and atrazine. But they know it's poison, so I'm sure that such people, they do not have the warriors type of amorality. Let me put it that way. I'm sure in private they revel in their wickedness as those other types I mentioned, and that they have developed all kinds of dehumanizing moral justifications for why you, the victim of their scams, all deserve what you're getting anyway. I'm sure fentanyl producers do the same in their heads, whether in China or secular family in America, or doctors who prescribe SSRI and other poisonous medications that are ruining not just your body, and that, by the way, will keep having effects after you take them. I will cover this later in show. But in some cases, they poison also your germline, and therefore your posterity's future, should you have any. They're usually morons, to be sure, the doctors, I mean. Maybe they don't know the effects, but yet others must know, and they do it for profit, and I'm sure they justify it the same way in private. Women do this. A woman will cheat on you, and that's not enough for her. She will also then have to make up a story about how you deserve it, how it's because of what you did. It's a trait universal to women, but unfortunately certain countries promote this kind of moralistic self-delusion as a kind of national vice. Well, I say all this because it doesn't matter in the end. If they poison to harm you, they will behave as if that's what they intended anyway. and their already worm-like, mendacious nature grows horns at that point, grows a forked tongue, and spits out bile, so it looks like a reptiloid conspiracy even when it may not be. You end up a poisoned gimp version of what you could have been anyway. Why does it matter, the motives? But anyway, their private wickedness aside, how do you deal with this yourself? How do you deal with the universal poisoning of modern life? Cities built on mountains of filth. Industries built on turning you into a rag for chemical refuse. How deal with this? In the ancient world, you could leave. You could leave some of these overpopulated villages where people lived in the middle of trash and manure also, for sure. But these days, it follows you almost everywhere you go. No possibility to be a hermit, almost. So what do? There is contamination and poisoning almost everywhere you go, as the entire world is covered in a matrix created by the chemical world order. That's right, the goblinoids of the chemical industry and of agribiz and the industrial farming complex have spread their poison through the world. There are only a few patches left clear of them now, very few. For example, Bhutan in Himalayas has pledged to be the first all-organic society. Russia has banned GMOs, along with Hungary and Japan, a few other spots, but of course, these places are themselves hardly untouched. Microplastics, contamination of almost all seafood, I believe, almost all world oceans. That said, there is a temptation then here to throw your hands up and say, well, what does it matter? It's all rotten. And to absolve these people who are siphoning poison in your throat. But no, never do that. It's particular industries, it's particular politicians and families of oligarchs. They hire, on top of this, an entire media proletariat of professors, of sophists, of think tankers and social media influencers to hunt down and run smear campaigns against anyone who calls them out. Monsanto did this to Taleb. Now let me ask you, when you think of Frog Twitter, aside from the fact that we, Frog Twitter, are degenerate autists, what is the one signature achievement of ours that you can think of? Do not touch receipts, right? It's entered popular culture by now. This concern, don't touch receipts. Even Andrew Yang is pandering to it too. What is in my byline on Twitter? Anti-xenoestrogen activist. Well, it's reasonable to assume that industries that rely on these substances, who have flooded the world with them for decades, it is reasonable to assume that they'd be interested perhaps in countering us somehow, in making sure that we don't effect a change in the people's culture that would turn them against this tide of chemical poison. In the end, it all really is about that to the ruling class, selling toothpaste. And this, it's all fine to assume modernity under the rule of merchants and commerce, that it lacks spirituality or high art, and to pretend to wring your hands about that, knowing that such concerns are very far really from the minds of most people. But how fine is it to realize that society is under the rule of those who seek only next year's profit for their own? And that's quite a generous time horizon. Often it's next month's profit. But how is it to assume that these people will have no qualms about turning you into a slave or shoving bugs down your throat? They've been shoving bugs down your throats for decades. And they primed and blinded you to that first. The debates about philosophy, about nature, all of these things end up looking very different from that point of view. This, what I will talk about on this show, the many ways you are poisoned in your food, by your pharmaceuticals, and the efforts of the dealers of poison to prime you to receive their trash. The mental poison is to prepare you to submit to the body poison. entire food supply almost is contaminated on many levels. Let me talk first about the non-chemical sense. You take apple juice, almost all apple juice, and certainly all of it from the big companies, is made out of rotten apples. They take rotten apples, they squeeze them. Now it is true that pasteurization will kill the fungus itself. But what you don't know is that the fungus releases toxins. And these are called mycotoxins. The toxin, and some biology cell can correct me if I'm wrong, but the toxin does not go away when you cook it. So there is no pasteurizing that out of the apple juice. So you're drinking poison. But I think this is just the most obvious case. Because in America, especially, other parts of the world too, of course, but in America, as you know, food production is centralized. Many of you are maybe hippies. You go to farmers' fairs now, and that's becoming more common, and it's a good thing. They're trying, very funny, to exclude the Nazis, so-called, from the alt-right, from selling their produce at farmers' market. You hear this is concern of the left. So some of you, left and right, you use farmers' market, but the vast majority shop from supermarkets that are stocked from far away by highway. I think there's only 2 weeks of food stocked in cities themselves, by the way, but in fact supermarkets have a few days worth of food at most. Why this is not treated on its own as a huge national weakness, I don't know. What do you do in a case of catastrophe that interrupts the supply routes? But okay, this different matter. A feature of the centralized food production is that prior to being distributed, the food is kept in giant warehouses. Now with meat, you can't really keep it unfrozen that way because it spoils and the customer can see right away spoiled meat. You can't mask it. But with many other things, you can keep it a long time in a warehouse, and especially so with grain. And this is why the entire grain supply of America is contaminated with mycotoxins. Even if the grain itself that you buy, whether wheat, rice, corn, whatever, even if this is not itself moldy, even if it's not passed, it's prime, it stayed before distribution a long time in a warehouse that is all mold, that was heavily contaminated with mycotoxins of various kinds, many of which they don't even know how to test for. This is why, for example, one batch of grain will be okay, but another might give you mystery feelings of disease, or even worse, that could last a while and is undiagnosed. But could lead, for example, to a cascade of allergic or inflammatory or other reactions. I don't believe, for example, that everyone suddenly became celiac, the gluten intolerant, but rather that it's the mycotoxins in modern wheat, in the United States in particular, that are making people sick. It's not any one general category of macronutrient itself that's causing these problems, I believe, but the contamination. And similarly, there is evidence that peanut and other allergies are caused by also these mycotoxins. The most frequent mycotoxin is called aflatoxin. You can look it up, and this is well known in places like Africa where it causes havoc, many deaths. But there are many others. For example, ochratoxin, O-C-H-R-A, ochratoxin, for example, and they can contaminate different types of foods in different countries, including animal products. The damage these poisons cause to people, the lives destroyed with mystery ailments, the health costs, of course, it's impossible to know the damage because no honest studies are carried out. The problem itself isn't given a proper hearing to begin with, because why would they? Would they change the entire model of food production? Remember, Rome was destroyed as a society because a few landowners ended up, I think Loci Julianus linked to a passage just this week where it shows that, for example, 6 or 7 landowners owned all of North Africa. Nero, the evil Emperor Nero, he had them butchered. That's one good thing that he did. But this enormous industrial farm system that late imperial Rome left behind, it leads to highly dysfunctional societies. I've already mentioned on previous show how France managed to get out of latifundia system. this mass farm, huge landowner system, only with hundreds of years of strife and warfare. And America, modern America, has gotten itself into the same hole, stupidly. My landlady in Argentina, before, she came from one of these families that owned, for example, half of some province. But she's one of these people who like to show off to me how she took the cheapest boat to Uruguay. And otherwise she put on displays of such frugality. Even the old rich, they have these affectations showing they're completely unworthy of their inheritance. Their inheritance should belong to me, so I can fund enormous archaeological digs. For example, I would dig up the entire shore of the Kara Sea and other parts of the Arctic. I would build a large Hadron Collider of my own. It reminds me, Lieutenant Commander Geordi LaForge from Star Trek, you know him? That actor, I think LeVar Burton, the actor that plays him, is a physicist in real life. She's the discoverer of the Higgs boson, the famous ghost particle, the Higgs boson. But in any case, you see, I believe in the real science, experiments where I would breed gorilla and human and create a class of workers. And I hear a rumor that Stalin had plans to do so. It's true, Stalin had plans to create hybrid race of human gorilla, but I suspect that had he been successful, there wouldn't have been the inauguration of communist paradise, but rather that Soviet college girls would have bragged to each other about how they were sport fucking the gorilla hybrid workforce. You think I'm making all this up? I'm not. Look it up. Ilya Ivanov. Oh yes, they were going to inaugurate the end state of communist paradise by using mutant ape workforce. But instead all they got was Brezhnev. Anyway, yes, you see, they are not going to change their entire social structure now, where a few large slave labor agribusiness interests will suddenly give up their power. So, you have to continue eating the ochratoxin and the other mycotoxin and who knows what else toxin-infused grains, you see. You have to. Monsanto needs its money. You'll just have to keep eating them. And to ensure you do so, they've hired a whole proletariat of mental tinkerers and academics. I may have to cover this on future show. The academic as a type to begin with. The mind and spirit of the so-called intellectual whore, who's actually lower in honor than a streetwalker. But that's for another time. Next segment, I will talk chemical contamination. You might think, well, if grains are infested with mycotoxins, and some dairy also, too, by the way, but then you can switch, you may think, to a carnivore diet and you will be safe. Meat, by the way, it can have mycotoxins too, especially pork, but it's much rarer, I think, in most countries at least. But you won't be free in this case, in any way, from the chemical poison, the chemical goblin that inhabits almost everything now. Oranges and many non-organic vegetables are sprayed. You know this already, but do you know that atrazine, which is the worst of the chemical pesticides, one of the worst in which many countries completely ban it. For example, it's banned in the European Union, many other places too, because it contaminates the water, it contaminates everything, and it gets into all animal products. It gets into the fat of the animal especially. It's one of the most powerful xenoestrogens. It's the one that turns frogs from male to female. It makes the frogs gay. That's all documented now. And of course, it was documented when Alex Jones first said it a long time ago. He was just following the studies that were already out at the time. But it's completely true. It's one of the most dangerous things. And the government approves its use on you. They think you're trash. The FDA thinks it's just fine to use atrazine. Forget escaping this by having carnivore. It gets into all animal products and is actually accumulated there in large quantity. You can have it grass-fed even and whatever, but if the atrazine is in the water of the ground, the pasture will be contaminated and so will the beef. For example, the epicenter of atrazine poisoning is in Illinois, I believe, the epicenter in United States. Menaquinone 4, by the way, of course, he helped me for this episode with secret dossier of information. But you see, once it gets into the water table, it will contaminate everything. So when you eat beef, they can even call it organic. But if it's from somewhere like Illinois, it will be poisoned meat. You might as well inject ground up birth control pills. You talk about eating bugs, they might as well make a meal of soy oil with a vinaigrette of bean husks and ground up birth control pills and a sprinkling of hops, because that's already most of your modern diet. It's in every animal product, so I'm sorry if the vegetarians are mostly right on this. Of course, they're hardly free from contamination of other kinds. You have to understand something shocking about what estrogen means. You think estrogen is the female hormone. I tell you that you've been made to think this. This is not a scientific or a medical fact. This is a product of marketing, the marketing of the chemical industry. Atrazine is hardly the only xenoestrogen. Estrogens are in everything now. Well, what are estrogens? Estrogen is a stress hormone, okay? It's not the female hormone. That's only incidental to the fact that cell division, and I'm speaking loosely now since, I'm not exactly a physiologist, no matter what you've heard, but let me speak loosely and poetically, but in substance, not wrongly. But in the female, there is menstruation process, and that process of cell division, of proliferation, is, so to speak, governed by estrogen, so the female needs, in some sense, an excess of estrogen to deal with that system, with that process, or more of it than the male does anyway. So now, of course, you will die without estrogen. It's necessary for all kinds of physiological processes, but what I'm telling you is that it's necessary above all for cell division and proliferation. And this is so to speak, this is a stress process of the body. There is a deep link between estrogen, serotonin, and stress response in the body. And an excess of estrogen is actually what you can see induces the metabolic state of cancer, which is the indiscriminate proliferation of certain kinds of cells, or what I have called the reversion of the organism to the yeast state, which is a state of pure proliferation. And you can look up for yourself the deep connection also between fungus, and estrogens, and the existence, even in particular, of mycoestrogens that pollute many things as well. But you see, this entire reality of estrogen as a stress hormone and the precursor of the cancer metabolic state, which of course is the stress metabolic state, that is the cause of so many other diseases as well. This was all obscured by the dirty trick of rebranding estrogen as the female hormone. And this was done with a whole proletariat of merchants, marketers, of doctors and researchers who bore false witness so they could be merchants too, so they could get one over you and change the culture, that is to prime the serfs to accept the mass contamination of their food supply and indeed of their everyday lives with chemicals that largely act as xenoestrogens. And it is not a coincidence that other substances promoted in modern life actually induce the same over-excitability by different pathways, neurological or psychological or otherwise, so that the entire modern condition can be described as one of hyperventilation and over-excitation. You know, this horrible advertisement, America runs on Dunkin'. Disgusting! They glory turning you into an infernal machine and they rub it in your face. Remember those ads for the gig economy? They thought that was a good idea, advertising your future as a frazzled Wojak Coomer. Well, anyway, so actually coffee is good for you on many levels and has numerous protective effects. It's not part of this complex of poison I mentioned. It acts in the body apparently in a manner analogous to progesterone, not to estrogen, which is to say, it protects the structure and integrity of your bodily functions and your energy, rather than promoting the opposite state that I mentioned, the one of stress and proliferation. That's what I mean. It's not that estrogen as such is bad, but it's that it contributes to this complex of poisons that promote overexcitation in the modern condition. There's just too much estrogen today as a consequence of chemical contamination. But the really shocking this is the extent to which modern marketing and the psychological warfare has succeeded, for example, in brainwashing nations to accept their poisoning by this rebranding of what estrogen really is. The only other example I can think of is how they managed to get you to eat paint thinner. Oh yes, paint thinner. You're eating industrial paint thinner daily now. Do you understand that? The vegetable oils, the ones made from, let's say, cottonseed oil, canola seed, canola oil, corn oil, and yes, of course, soy oil, but these kinds of polyunsaturated fatty acid oils were used, let's say, 100 years ago as paint thinner. These were industrial oils used only for such purposes, not human consumption. But they were rebranded through a giant fraud of marketing as food, and even as superior to saturated fat, which was demonized. You know, saturated fat oils were the ones that were used back then. Everything was lard, or the popcorn was made with coconut oil. But as a result of this giant marketing psyop fraud, the 20th century is replete with such frauds and big lies, no doubt. But as a result of that, they managed to get you all eating industrial poisons, polyunsaturated fatty acid-rich oils that are really pure poison. Why are they poison? What do you think, you dummy, that a plant wants to be eaten? That it wants you to eat its seeds, which is where these oils come from? Organisms that cannot move, that cannot run or fight with teeth or claws, they will develop toxic means of self-defense. And this is not an exception. This is how they modulate the immune system of an animal that dares to eat the seeds. So actually PUFA, these vegetable oils, I'll just call them PUFA, is used, I believe, even in modern hospitals for immunosuppression. Because that's what they do. They do also something else. You know, your body makes hormones out of fats, right? Saturated fats. Well, these particular fats, the PUFA, will interfere with the hormonal signaling in your body and entirely throw it off. So this will end up having cascading effects in your body, effects that can last quite a long time after a PUFA-heavy meal. PUFA, vegetable oils, are in other words pure poison. The reason, nuts, almonds, walnuts, for example, the reason they have such levels of vitamin E, and the reason certain plants do, is because PUFAs are highly unstable. They readily oxidize or go rancid, and this ends up having an enormous toxic poisoning effect within an organism. And vitamin E is there to prevent this process. That's why it's in such high level in nuts and certain plants. That's the only reason it's there. That's what it's for. So here's a quick fix tip, only one I will give you on this show. If you eat a modern meal out on a restaurant, and PUFAs are everywhere now if you eat out, you will feel sick, usually, often. And then to counter this, you can try having some unrefined virgin coconut oil after, like a teaspoon at least. Because coconut oil has in the body a very similar effect to vitamin E. So it will counter the PUFAs that you eat that day. It has quite a few other positive effects besides, by the way. You know, real coconut oil is antiseptic at the cellular level. The dairy industry uses it as a way to sterilize its equipment. It's used as an industrial antiseptic, coconut oil. It's a pretty strong antimicrobial, particularly against fungi, by the way. And a little bit, for example, a teaspoon, will often stop many feelings of unexplained mild illness that can come from endotoxin poisoning in your intestines. So anyway, you see what I'm saying? That PUFA, though, they were totally unused 100 years ago, but by marketing tricks and by buying whore doctors and whore academics and researchers, they managed to brainwash nations into self-poisoning. They should be completely banned. To the extent that now PUFAs are actually now in everything. When you eat out, it's basically impossible to avoid vegetable oils. So let's say you decide, okay, I will eat meat at a restaurant. But if that meat was marinated in a broth of salt and other things, and especially what I mean in a broth of soy oil or canola oil, they won't tell you that on the menu. You go on an airplane and nearly everything is made of soy. The cookies, the bread, everything has soy oil, which is very cheap. I think 40 times cheaper than, for example, butter. So that butter is fake and it's actually made with soy oil on airplanes. Everything is soy. That's not an alt-right exaggeration, and it's incredibly destructive, quite aside from the fact that soy itself is an estrogen as well. It's destructive merely by the fact that it's one of these most dangerous rancid vegetable oils. They're essentially giving you rotten food to eat, you understand, and they cover up that rottenness with food coloring and a few tricks. All modern food science of the food industry is a scam to get you to eat rancid, rotten garbage, literal trash poison. So anyway, what they did with rebranding industrial paint thinner as a good for your health vegetable oil, pure vegetable poison, literally the toxins the plant uses to defend itself. They also rebranded in a similar way estrogens as the female hormone. It's a decades-old psyop through which they actually changed the culture to prime it to accept this. So let me ask you something. When you see that my byline on Twitter says anti-xenoestrogen activist, and when my book made such a splash, of course, relatively small in the scale of things, but still, almost no media is not owned by a faction today. So do you think that these industries of mass poisoning, who see somebody who is not owned, who advertises himself as an anti-xenoestrogen activist that comes from a group that promotes propaganda, you could say, or knowledge about the dangers of estrogens, do you think that these industries of mass poisoning, which form one of the main branch of the Lords of Lies, do you think they may have noticed and sought to take countermeasures? I don't know, but do you think they look ahead and see that if my ideas or frog ideas enter the mainstream popular culture, it's a terminal level event for their industry? Well, I don't know if this happened, but it seems plausible. But what kind of person would they send? They do not send their best. Let me put it this way. No, they do not send best. The people who they can get to make war on conservationism and on healthy living, these are not the best people. One would even be surprised if such efforts were not disorganized and were not clumsy. I don't know. I don't know that they are doing this, but I would expect that they are. They fund so-called think tanks that specialize just in this. I will be right back. I talk pharmaceutical poisoning next. Trump's famous tweet about massive injections in infants causing autism has been persistent subject of ridicule for establishment and for Redditors. And I'm not going to touch the vaccination controversy because there are others who do it well already. You can find many resources on that. I have not studied it enough to know what position to take myself on it, but I am very skeptical of medical establishment claims, if only because I know how worthless they are in general. One of the most red-pilling statistics you can find. Well, just find the number of people who die as a result of going to the hospital every year. Find out how many die because of doctor iatrogenic deaths. It's enormous. The lowest estimate I've seen is about 100,000 per year of deaths caused by doctors, but most studies have it around 250,000 or as high as 500,000 or higher per year. And these are mainstream sources like Legacy Media and Johns Hopkins and so on. You can go look it up yourself, and you have to multiply that casualty rate, that number of, let's say, 250,000 by many times to find out how many they don't die maybe when they go to doctor, but they get diseases, and often horrible, uncurable diseases, and they are maimed for life because of doctors. So I don't believe them as a group. I don't believe doctors attract toadies. And soon they will have, as Michael Savage claims, they will put a guy from Bangladesh, Dhaka Medical School, to do your surgery and to garlic breath you while he fiddles inside your body. So no, I do not trust doctors, and so you start to feel ill because of the poisonings I've already described, let's say, or because you eat canned oysters from China. America is surrounded by oceans, but imports, I think, 95% of its seafood. And if you're not careful to source it, you will eat shrimp grown literally in a sewer in Thailand, or Chinese oysters that somehow, even with the shipping costs included, they end up being cheaper than American oysters. How does that work? If you don't get sick enough to go to the doctor, they will say, go to doctor, you're okay. It's good food, you buy cheap now. This Chinese product, Chinese food. But you try to take measures against these vague ailments that plague you, let's say. The kinds of poisonings I described in segments on show already. So then let's say you resort to medicines, to pharmaceuticals. And I think people don't understand just how destructive these medical products are. These are being shown. These are already very interesting studies on this, on pharmaceuticals as such. And this is what I want to talk about in this segment. For the deleterious effects, actually, of particular classes of medicines, I think many of you might already know. For example, that Tylenol is a leading cause of liver failure in America. It's deadly when you mix it with alcohol. And that the other anti-inflammatories, like ibuprofen or naproxen, all of those will be very hard on your kidneys, but especially on your gastrointestinal system. And studies show scarring of the intestines, even with casual use of these anti-inflammatories in mice, for example. It's reversed. This is another tip, by the way. This kind of scarification of the intestines by ibuprofen or whatever is reversed somewhat by a prolonged use of cat's claw, which is an Amazonian herb that also to some extent reverses the ill effects of smoke on the lungs and of damage to the ear canal by loud sound. In fact, I think it's one of the only things shown to do so, cat's claw, Uncaria tomentosa. But in any case, for those of you who take anti-inflammatories daily because of the pains of daily life, or because you have a physical job, this is also a big temptation for bodybuilders and powerlifters who often have pains. But if you take ibuprofen at a high level daily for a year, you're dead. It will crush your organs in the long term. And even in the short term, doctors are such fools. They often prescribe things like omeprazole, which is a drug that's supposed to prevent this kind of damage to the gastric system. But it was found that it just moves the damage from the upper part, where you will feel while it's happening. It will just shift the damage to the intestines. So there is basically no way to avoid the damage of even the most casual pharmas when you take them. And then if you look at the best-selling pharmaceuticals, the best-selling drugs, those that sell for the highest price, look at the list of the top 10. And so many of them are, let's say, the very advanced class of anti-inflammatories, the biologicals, so-called, the immune modulators that are supposed to treat autoimmune disorders, the mystery inflammatory diseases that have suddenly become so common now. You see advertisements on TV about this all the time in America, yes? These are drugs. It's very depressing because when you look at what they do, is they don't actually cure any of these diseases. They're very expensive, but they cure nothing. And often they have very little positive effect. And the side effects are immune suppression, similar to immune destroying diseases and cancers and many other such things. This is not to say they're not necessary in some cases. I've heard, for example, of older people or people in very dire situations whose life was saved from rheumatoid arthritis that can get very out of hand. But as a class of drugs, these biologicals are remarkably ineffective because, and I make this prediction now, I've made it before in writing on my Twitter, but these diseases are entirely misunderstood, I believe. The whole model of autoimmunity and allergy promoted now is misunderstood. I believe they are actually caused by pathogens, and not just in the inception, but are continually active in the body, and that these pathogens are very hard to test for or to culture. Often they don't look for them. And in other cases, I'll make claim on record now that there are entire classes of organisms that haven't yet been discovered. They actually discover such things all the time, but not in humans necessarily. They do not widely publicize this. But for example, just a few years ago, a eukaryote that is neither bacteria nor fungus, but something almost intermediate, was found recently to populate the bodies of certain nematodes, certain worms. And there's considerable epidemiological evidence that many of these mystery diseases, including multiple sclerosis, are caused by fungal-like organisms. These are classes of organisms, very primitive, cryptic ones, like the Borrelia organism that causes Lyme's disease, that actually induce inflammation in the body. This is their strategy because they feed on the byproducts of that inflammation. And this is also a persistent strategy of many fungal strains. They induce inflammation in part also to hide from the host's immune system. And I believe eventually that what I say now will be discovered, but this discussion, interesting as it is, the point I want to make in this segment is quite different and has to do with the ill effects of pharmaceuticals as such. Because there is evidence that all pharmaceuticals, yes, all medicines, but especially the antidepressants, the SSRIs, and the mood modulators, all these kinds of medicines of various kinds, they may induce epigenetic changes to your DNA in some sense, and therefore these side effects of these drugs will persist after you stop taking them. In other words, they may be doing permanent damage to you. I direct you to a study, a 2009 study in a journal called Medical Hypotheses. Look up study by Choka, spelled C-S-O-K-A. I will link it on my account, Antony Choka, titled Epigenetic Side Effects of Common Pharmaceuticals, a Potential New Field in Medicine and Pharmacology. It's an amazing paper. It's short study. You don't have to be an expert to understand it. But over the last decade, it's become more and more clear that pharmaceuticals of all kinds have long-term effects even after use is discontinued. At first, they try to say this is some kind of mass psychosomatic syndrome or that patients were delusional. They always do this kind of thing. But by now, it's become ever more clear that is not the case, and that for SSRIs, antidepressants, which are prescribed so much today, including to children, the evidence is of frequent loss of sexual drive and sexual function. In up to 15% of those who take them, or even more, will experience some loss of sexual function. And some it's total. They become celibate. And it's reflected also in rodent studies by now. I have frequently criticized the trads, the traditionalists, among those of you, because you go on rants about how our supposedly voluptuous and hedonist time. We live supposedly in a time of hedonism, but that is propaganda. We are not in a hedonist age. We're in a neurotic and joyless and asexual age that rather makes a moral point out of joyless sexual interactions. Often they don't even take place. Our society promotes rather onanism instead. It's quite different. The writer Scott Alexander of Slate Star Codex, many of you know him. He wrote how he became permanently asexual after taking SSRIs. But there are many cases, maybe even among people you know, Maybe they do not admit it. It's a catastrophe. And especially because many pharmaceuticals have transgenerational effects. They introduce germline mutations as also certain supplements. There's evidence, for example, that resveratrol does this, on which I recommend caution regarding resveratrol especially. But for supplements and vitamins, it's quite rare, very unusual. But pharmaceuticals, the opposite, very common. It appears to be the rule that by their nature, which I may discuss sometime, the entire model of the pharmaceutical production and why it could have these effects. But they will all introduce different kinds of these changes. For example, NSAIDs, the anti-inflammatory COX-2 inhibitors, the ones that I discussed already, they will introduce permanent elevated cardiovascular risk, and other drugs will have other long-term effects. It's obvious what I mean. I mean, pharmas are a literal poison, okay? And they may be life-saving in some cases. Sure, antibiotics can save life, but of course, even in there, especially the chloroquine class of antibiotics will have very severe long-term effects that are already widely known by now. But I would strongly recommend that aside from life-saving situations, you stay away from taking any pharmaceutical long-term as a matter of lifestyle, because this is the way they poison you and indeed your posterity. If you take SSRIs, look into a way to gradually go off them. And the danger for mankind that we have reached in our time is almost of an unprecedented sort. You know, the hand-wringing conservative critique, I mentioned it briefly in first segment, is that technology introduces plenty, that it introduces prosperity, and that the only bad effects of modern technology are apathy or anomie, the loss of higher culture in mass society, or the spiritual heights of man are supposedly lost, over which you can supposedly hand-wring. And they do so, they hand-wring about it while they wear an ascot and visit ghetto bathhouses. But the reality is very different. That's not just the only danger, the loss of high culture. It is the permanence, rather, of the slum, the use of technology to spread mass poisoning, massive rottenness, mass poisoning, mass fraud, the destruction of the lives and health of millions, the deformity of mankind's biological substance across generations, which is the only thing that for us matters in the end. Which brings me to the fundamental message of Frog Twitter, the core group, which is political conservationism. The concerns of mommy bloggers, middle-aged women with children. These are in many ways the same concerns of Frog Twitter. To call us a youth movement is fine. It can be good publicity in some way, I suppose, but in the end, it is not all we are. Mothers who don't want their children to be poisoned, whether by lettuce picked up by Oaxacan day laborers who play with their feces on the big agribase latifundia, or by pharmaceuticals, or by other forms of contamination of food. You know, airs, waters, places. This is our concern too. And for the moment, it's only Frog Twitter and mommy bloggers who really care about conserving health and nature in this way. The left has entirely given up on that. All of their organizations that are supposed to do one thing, for example, preserve air quality, really have all just become fronts for tranny or lesboid rights. City councils from Chicago or rural Minnesota feel the need to comment on events in the Polish parliament now instead of serving vital interests of their own place. In other words, there's systematic corruption of institutions that no longer do what they are supposed to do. And this is nowhere more true than for the environment. The Sierra Club was founded in the vision of John Muir, a conservationist who promoted the idea of nature preserves. And until very recently, the Sierra Club actually cared about preservation of these parks, about clean air and water. But it was subverted by big donors, like all other environmental groups. Right now, the only supposedly environmental matter they promote is global climate change, which is such a large matter that it would be unsolvable even if it were real. But its reality for the moment exists mostly just in computer models. And the evidence is, in my opinion, very ambiguous. The fact is, even if they're right, this is something that can be argued against, and their solution is just a wealth transfer from the first world to the third world that has nothing to do to solve this problem. It does nothing. But the only thing it does, it advances the old goal of the left, which is global wealth transfer. That was also the fundamental program of Lenin as well as of Rawls. It's always the same thing, the same goal, no matter what justifications are used. But meanwhile, the plastics pollutions of the oceans, most of which comes from third world and from China, they have little to say on that. They say nothing about that, or very rarely they say ineffective things on that, such as banning straws. Recycling will not solve that problem. Nor do they have much to say about destruction of air quality, the possible ill effects of the 5G network on human and animal health, on the health of birds, the mass use of pesticides and of glyphosate, the pervasive xenoestrogen contamination of the world, the filth in our cities, disease and misery spread by the tolerance of the homeless, and by the creeping shantytowns caused by mass third world immigration. You absolutely can't be someone who cares for nature or any of these things, but also believe in open borders. And as many of you know, the Sierra Club was an anti-immigration outfit for just this reason. Because population increase puts pressure on the environment quite aside from even just the quality of the immigrant. But the Sierra Club absurdly changed its position in the 1990s as a result of a big donation by David Gelbaum. They became whores, just like almost all professors. They are paid catamites for David Gelbaum and those interests, and are intellectual whores and propagandists now. The guy leading the Sierra Club at the time, by the way, when they made this change, when they abandoned immigration restriction, the guy who forced through this change, his name was Adam Werbach, W-E-R-B-A-C-H, Werbach. I mean, go look at this guy's face. If you want to see a deformed, inbred, Stettelbilly face, look at Adam Werbach. Go look at his face and you will understand entirely the meaning of this change, okay? It's the complete subversion of the environmental movement by the lowest elements of American society, so that now it's just another zombie institution that only wears the skin and the rhetoric of its former self, but serves interests quite different from the environment or of conservationism. But do you believe that people who grow up thinking that animals, for example, are machines created for man's use, and that outsiders do not have souls, do you believe such people will have any care for the well-being of nature or of mankind, even when this ancient hatred is secularized? But regardless, all the institutions that were supposed to care for the airs, waters, places, for the preservation of pristine nature have been subverted now. So now the only people who still carry on this fight are mommy bloggers who have children, and they do not want their offspring and posterity reduced to deformity and slavery, and then also us, Frog Twitter, who share the same aims. And this is because the preservation of the biological heritage of mankind and the possibility of a political morality that is based on breeding, that has at its center not the individual or his comforts, nor the proliferation of the species or of mere life by quantity, but instead that sees nature from the point of view of the instinct for beauty, which is to say, the preservation of its kinds by type and the increase in distinction among them. Maybe some of my friends would not go as far as I do in this, but we are all you can think of basically the principle of natural conservationism, but now applied also to politics at large, to peoples, to the fates of nations. This is our concern. This is why we stand against mass immigration, because it is analogous to the presence of invasive species that wipe out local species and that destroy local kinds and types and the special local ecology. We stand against this for the same reason a conservationist would stand against the introduction, for example, of Asian carp in mid-western water bodies. Humans, yes, have always traveled, always colonized and conquered, but don't let the other side fool you with this propaganda. That's not what is going on here. This is not Vikings or Phoenicians or Spanish colonizing and exploring. This is the mass slave drivers that have taken hold of the West, a few hundred large crony interests. They are inviting invasive species by mass so as to harass their own competitors locally. I stand against the previous attempts of the English, for example, to do the same, where they use Tamils as biological warfare around the world. They introduced Tamils from South India as their invasive species of laborers in parts of Africa where they do not belong in such numbers, or in Fiji, where they came to outnumber the local population. This must not happen, and the Anglo introduced also the black to the New World as a form of biological warfare against the noble native tribes here in the Americas. I stand completely against that as well. These are processes quite unlike previous forms of migration or models of elite dominance or conquest, and such changes are destructive of natural types and must be resisted or reversed. This is origin, I would say, of our opposition to immigration. At least it's mine, as well as the meaning of my so-called racism. And everything I've talked about in this show is a reflection of our concern with the conservation of nature, which is why there can never be any compromise or agreement between us and agribusiness as it exists now, between us and industrial farms and factory animal husbandry, or between us and the agrochemical industry, or the degenerated slave-based modes of food production that are being imposed now. We can never agree to what the pharmaceutical industry, or in general the entire medical sector of the West, is doing. So you see who opposes us, because these are enormous interests with enormous power and influence in politics and media. Basically everything you see in media as a production of academia. They're teaching about nature, about race. Almost everything is designed as lies by these crony industries to prime you to accept their trash and poison down your throat. And we will never come to any agreement with them, but will remain their mortal enemies. And the medical sector alone is a fifth or a sixth of the American economy. So you can see the struggle we are trying to engage in. It is an enormous obstacle. But the truth is on our side. And in this case, the havoc and destruction and poisoning wrought by these fraud industries is so great, and its threat to quality of life and to life itself is so enormous and immediate, that I do believe we have a chance of success against them merely by publicizing our case. Because more and more people are waking up to the treachery, and they're seeking modes of life where they will not be turned into a gimp and a mummified puppet of these monstrosities. But you must understand what we are and what we're not. The fight against mass immigration, against the introduction of the lies of gender theory and the chemical castration of the young, against the poisoning of nature and the destruction of your health. Our fight also against industry of lies and the saccharine lies like human equality, the lie against nature, the teaching of human rights that is a fraud, that supports all of this satanic evil that I have described. This is all the same fight, because for us it is the fight for the preservation of ancient virgin forest, of the same forest within man and among the peoples. And anyone who works to deny this, whatever arguments and self-delusions they use, remember they are partisans only of deformity and slavery in the end, while we are the partisans and soldiers of nature.